Hello, welcome to the EPG Pathshala program in linguistics.
I'm Pramod Pandey from the Center for Linguistics, Jawaharlal Nehru University. In the series of 4 modules, we will be discussing some of the basic aspects of generative phonology. In the present module, we will begin with the origins of generative phonology. The origin of generative phonology lies in the realization of the goals of generative grammar. In generative phonology, as in generative grammar, the goal of phonological theory is explanation, not description, unlike in the structural phonology, where describing the phonological properties of a language was the main goal. Here, in generative phonology, the main goal is to account for the knowledge that speakers have of the phonological structure of their languages. Generative phonology also differs from structural phonology in terms of the use of distinctive features in place of phonemes in formulating rules and in representing speech sounds. There is also a connection between structural phonology and generative phonology. In structural phonology too, we had 2 levels, phonemic and phonetic or allophonic. In generative phonology, we call them underlying and surface levels of representation. The difference between the underlying and surface levels compared to phonemic and allophonic levels is that in the underlying representation, we look at the representation of a morpheme across its occurrence in the words of the languages. Thus, we do not restrict the representation of a morpheme to simple words, but also to complex and compound words. This is a basic difference between phonology in generative grammar and phonology in structural grammar. In structural grammar, you will recall that levels of linguistic analysis, such as phonetics, phonemics, morphology, syntax, these had to be kept separate. You could not mix the levels. That is, if you are doing phonological analysis, you couldn't involve morphemes in phonological analysis. Just as in doing morphological analysis, you couldn't involve syntax in morphological analysis. In generative phonology, the strict separation of levels is not followed. On the screen, we have the 2 main linguists who laid the foundations of generative phonology, namely Noam Chomsky and Maurice Haller. Together, they brought out the book called The Sound Pattern of English, or SPE for short. The basic premises of generative phonology, whose foundations were laid in Sound Pattern of English, are the following. 1. Phonology is part of a generative grammar, and phonological knowledge is part of linguistic knowledge, in that phonological structure reflects the linguistic competence of the individual native speaker. 2. The competence of the individual native speaker lies in the ability to compute the phonetic representation on the basis of which to interpret the syntactic structure of a sentence in a language. 3. Phonological competence as part of an individual speaker's linguistic competence can be investigated following the methods of normal science. The normal scientific method involves refutation as one of the main criteria, along with observation. In generative phonology, the basic method of investigating phonological knowledge is to observe the behavior of speakers in terms of the production of speech and then propose hypotheses which can be refuted. Hypotheses are statements that are stated in such a way that there is no way in which they could be refuted or proved to be false or of no use. This is the general method used in natural science. It's also the main method used in generative phonology. Now, apart from the premises that we've just discussed, there are certain tenets of classical generative phonology. The classical generative phonological theory, which was propounded in Sound Pattern of English, had some of the tenets which were practiced for a long time until they came to be revised. What were the main tenets of generative phonology in its classical inception? First, the goal of the theory of generative phonology, in accordance with the theory of generative grammar, was to develop an explicit phonology that generates all and only the surface forms of a language. So explicitness was one of the main tenets of classical generative phonology. The second tenet was that phonological representations in the explicit phonologies were linear sequences of matrices of feature values. So segments were assumed to be composed of bundles of features which were arranged in a sequence. That was the basic tenet regarding the representation of phonological units. The third tenet was that in order to generate the forms of a language, phonology should employ derivational means, that is, sequential processual analysis. This was one of the main claims of the theory of generative phonology, the standard generative phonology, that is. So there is a relationship between the underlying form and the surface form in terms of a series of phonological rules applying and changing the underlying form to the intermediate forms of representations one by one until the surface phonetic representation is arrived at. This was the third main tenet of generative phonology. And the fourth main tenet of generative phonology was the discovery and empirical establishing of explicit rule ordering, which was consistent with the data. So we have the goal of explicit phonology, then the goal of representing sounds in terms of sequences of matrices of feature values, and then the derivational nature of the relationship between the underlying form and the surface form, and then finally the ordering amongst the phonological rules in the grammar. These four tenets defined classical generative phonology. We will see later on in a course that follows, namely advanced phonology, that the development in the theory of generative phonology involved modifying some of these basic tenets. On the screen, you have the model of generative grammar. Phonology is part of the model of generative grammar as proposed in the first theory of generative grammar, namely syntactic structures. In the syntactic structures, we have three main components: lexicon, syntax, and phonology. So the words are stacked in the lexicon along with the exceptional features of the language. So the lexicon is the repository of the knowledge of words and all the idiosyncratic properties of the grammar, including syntactic phonological properties. Then the words come to syntax in the derivation, and then finally the syntactic structure is mapped onto the phonological structure. So the phonology comes after syntax. This particular model has come to be revised substantially in the following theories such as extended standard grammar, the principles and parameters theory of generative syntax, and now the minimalist theory of generative syntax. The basic assumption, however, about the structure model of phonological representation continues to be held in spite of the various modifications. On the screen you have the classical model of generative phonology now. Now, as we said, that the model of generative phonology assumes two levels of representation, the underlying representation and the surface phonetic representation, and in between you have rules which are ordered in relation to one another. Now, what are the main features of standard generative phonology? Based on the model that you have just seen, we will, at the risk of repetition, we will point out some of the basic features of generative phonology. Number one, there are two levels of phonological representation, the underlying and the surface. Number two, to repeat, phonological representations were linear sequences of matrices of feature values. Three, the derivational means of relating the underlying form to the surface form. And four, discovering and empirically establishing the explicit rule ordering in the language which was consistent with the data. So you had your view on the data, and in order to explain the data consistently with the help of the rules of a grammar, the generative phonologist tried to find the ordering amongst the various phonological rules that were proposed. This also satisfied some other goals of the theory of generative phonology. We will discuss it in a subsequent module. Now, here we will look at some of the phonological alternations based on which the underlying representations of morphemes are established. Two types of phonological alternations were conceived of in generative phonology. These could be termed as allophonic alternations and neutralizing alternations. Allophonic alternations are found in, for example, pronunciations of words in English, for example, when you say speak but peak. So the phoneme p has two different allophones, p as in peak and p as in speak. As you know, following sir, the voiceless plosives are not aspirated. So the alternation of the phoneme p in terms of its allophones, p and p, can be termed as allophonic alternations. This was one of the main topics of discussion in structural phonology. What we find in generative phonology is that there is a focus now on neutralizing alternations. What are these neutralizing alternations? Neutralizing alternations are called neutralizing alternations because they neutralize the contrast between phonemes. So they involve alternations between phonemes. That's why the distinction between the phonemes is neutralized in certain contexts. So the important thing is the context in which they are neutralized. Now, these contexts are of three main kinds, or rather, three main types. One, phonological context. That is, the neutralization takes place purely in terms of the phonological environment that surrounds them. Two, morphologically conditioned. That is, the environment includes in it morphological information. For example, the fact that a morpheme follows another morpheme or is at the beginning of a word, and so on. And then the third neutralizing alternation is lexically conditioned. That is, in certain words, only the morpheme can have different realizations. For example, fur in knife is realized as ver in knives. Now, this is lexically conditioned. There is no absolute rule which says fur must become ver before the plural morpheme, as in knife, knives. Because you have other forms such as strife, strifes, not strives, and so on. So, fur and ver alternation is sort of restricted to certain lexical items. Now, let's take a look at some of the examples. And on the screen, you have examples from Hindi. Now, in Hindi, you will be familiar. Before a plosive, the nasal consonant is realized as having the same place as the plosive. So, before the or ta, it is na. Before da or ta, it is na. Before ja, it is nya. Before ga or ka, it is ma. And before pa or ba, it is ma. So, 5 nasals: na, na, nya, ma, and then ma. 5 nasals. If you look at the phoneme in Hindi, we notice that at least 3 of these nasal consonants are contrastive. So, ma and na are 2 different phonemes altogether. Similarly, na in a lot of words contrast with ma. So, at least we have na, ma, and na, 3 different phonemes. What we find in Hindi is that before a plosive, the contrast between these nasal consonants is lost, is neutralized. That is, in all contexts where you have a bilabial plosive, you will always get a ma nasal, and before dental plosives, you get a na nasal, and so on and so forth. Now, this is an example of phonologically conditioned alternation in Hindi. As example of morphologically conditioned alternation, we have the famous case of English plurals, for example. Look at the screen for the data. Or you will be familiar with most of these examples, but we are using them simply to illustrate some of these notions. In this case here, the notion of morphologically conditioned alternation. So, the plural morpheme, the regular plural morpheme, has 3 allomorphs, namely sa, za, and is. Now, notice in the first column you have cats. Sa is occurring after ta, pa, ka. In the second column, the middle column, you have the plural morpheme being pronounced as za. Notice that the spelling is the same, but we have mobs, bags, robes, boys. Boys means boy ends in a vowel, so even after vowels, you always get a za, like row, rows, tie, ties, etc. And then you have buzz, is allomorph. The is allomorph occurs after only 6 of the phonemes, namely sa, za, cha, ja, and sha, ja. Thus, we have buses, buzzes, garages, etc. Now, how do we account for this alternation? We notice that we will have to account for it in terms of 2 processes. One is the z-sir relationship in terms of either z is devoiced as sir or sir is voiced as is, and the other is the insertion of e or its deletion in z-sir. Now, when we weigh the pros and cons of the possible analysis, the rules that are proposed for this morphological alternation are stated as on the screen. So we assume that the underlying representation is z. Then in the grammar, we have the rule of e epenthesis, insertion, which says insert an e between the plural suffix z and the preceding stem, which ends in a strident consonant, namely sa, za, sha, cha, ja. And there is a morphological boundary there. The morphological boundary is to ensure that this happens only in these suffixes. In addition to this, there is another rule which can be termed voicing assimilation. You could call it devoicing as well, but it's assimilation because the change from voiced to voiceless consonant is conditioned by the stem ending in a voiceless consonant. So the consonant of the suffix assimilates in voicing feature to the final consonant of the stem. Both are voiceless. So now we have then, this is a case of purely morphologically conditioned alternation. The alternation between z, sir and is in the plural, regular plural suffix is determined by the morphology. It occurs after a stem in those suffixes and not everywhere. So it is assumed that within a stem, this relationship between the voiced and voiceless consonants doesn't need to hold. As a last case, we have alternation, which is not only phonologically conditioned, but also morphologically conditioned and lexically conditioned. We have alternations like these, which means that we don't have a strict separation amongst phonologically conditioned, morphologically conditioned, and lexically conditioned alternation. But we find them to be combined in certain cases. For example, in English, an extremely restricted kind of, but productive kind of alternation is that between k and sir. Now, most of these, if you pay close attention, most of the words in which this alternation is found, k, sir, have a Latinate origin. That means that in the history of the development of English, the words from Latin were borrowed along with the alternations in them. So we have electric, electricity, specific, specificity, public, publicity, medical, medicinal. Notice that the cursor alternation in the above examples follows the derivational morpheme boundary. So k changes to sir before an e, which belongs to the following morpheme, like et. The alternation, the rule as stated as such, requires that the alternation be morphologically conditioned. So there is a relationship between k and sir. Before a front vowel, k is fronted to sir. It is fricativized as well. But the front vowel as the environment must be present in the following morpheme, so that this alternation cannot take place before an e, which is in the same morpheme. So if you have king, for example, it doesn't become sing. or kit, does it become sit, etc. So for the E, it has to be in the following morpheme to be able to condition, to be able to bring about a change in K and so alternation. And of course, we already noticed that the examples of cursor alternation are extremely limited, mostly in Latinate words. So we have looked at the neutralizing alternations, which are phonologically conditioned, morphologically conditioned, and lexically conditioned. We will close now for the present module. We have looked at the basic foundations of the theory of generative phonology, how it started as a part of generative grammar and came to acquire some of these tenets of generative grammar. In the following module, we'll look at how we choose one phonological analysis over another phonological analysis.